True crime podcasts, films, and docuseries have become the craze over the last decade. These stories have helped to inform the public on major cases, criminal justice issues, and even served as a catalyst to solving cold cases or bringing attention to wrongful convictions. In this episode of the Truth Be Told podcast, we're going to explore the process of making a documentary with filmmaker and journalist Jia Rizvi.
This is the Truth Be Told podcast, where we unlock the secrets of strategic communication.
Jia Rizvi is an award-winning documentary filmmaker, podcaster, and writer who pursues stories of wrongful convictions. Her debut film, Conviction, chronicles the shortcomings of the American criminal justice system. Conviction saw success on the festival circuit and won awards for Best Picture, Best Cinematography, and an award of distinction prior to releasing on Amazon Prime. Jia is also the co-host of Speaking of Crime, a true crime series investigating mysterious cases. Jia was awarded the Digital Trends DEI Award in 2022 for her work on the film and podcast, and has hosted numerous episodes of the Emmy Award-winning show, The List. In this episode, we'll learn what it's like behind the scenes of making a true crime documentary and Jia's mission to advocate for others. Welcome to the Truth Be Told podcast. I'm your host, Dave Thompson. I am here with filmmaker, journalist, fashionista, friend, Jia Rizvi. How are you today?
I'm good. How are you?
I am good. Before we get into anything, I know we first connected or met at the Innocence Network conference, and I always have a great time there because the amount of stories that you hear, whether it's from exonerees, freed people, attorneys, kind of going through their experience in all these different cases is fascinating. And you've now made it your purpose to help people tell their stories. But at those events or those conferences, what's kind of been the biggest just takeaway that you've had in those experiences?
I think the same as you a lot. I just love meeting these people and hearing their stories and talking to them. But the reason I love that conference so much more than others is because that's the one place where I find I work with people who are wrongfully convicted every day. And this is the one place where I find they're let loose and they're having a good time. And it's just so heartwarming to see them all enjoying themselves when they've had this history of, abuse pretty much.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's interesting. We tell these stories all the time, whether it's in our training classes or watch a documentary, which we're going to talk about here in a minute. But having a conversation with somebody at the bar and having a beer with someone who's been wrongfully convicted and incarcerated for a couple decades, and then they're able to kind of share their story just raw and genuine is pretty impactful.
Oh, it is. It is. And it's such a different world that, I would have known nothing about had I not ventured into this work. And then when they are unfiltered, like at a bar or something, like you said, over a beer, they'll tell you anything and everything. And it's fascinating.
Yeah. For me, it helped kind of bridge the gap between, for us training, what we're doing, the impact that it really has on the criminal justice system, but also just as a layperson watching true crime, watching a documentary. And then when you meet somebody who's actually experienced that, is bridging that gap from like reality to fiction, that these are not just movies. These are real people and real stories. And sometimes I think people miss that connection.
For sure. The thing that got me in the very beginning, that got me even more passionate about this cause, is that I find that these people go through this horrific experience and they come out the other side so kind and not angry and not bitter. And they somehow, I always say this, and I don't know how to really explain it well. They more than anyone I know in my life, these people understand the meaning of life. It's like no BS. It's like they're just always there to help. They're kind. Because they've just been treated, the worst ever. And so they don't have any of these traits that we often find in people day to day that don't have that lived experience, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point. And I'm going to drop just a couple names of people I've had that experience with. Terrell Swift, one of them, Marty Tankliff, another, and people who've been wrongfully convicted, incarcerated. And I felt the same, somebody who's kind of representing the investigative space, that when I talk to somebody who's been wronged by that system, there's going to be animosity and frustration and anger. Mm-hmm. And I was met with the exact opposite. I was met by people who just they want to figure out how can they help change this so it doesn't happen again. How can they enlighten other people? How can they make a difference? And yeah, it's fascinating to me to have that kind of clarity at that point.
It is. And I've found it to be so fulfilling to be surrounded by people like that all the time. So it's just immersed me more and more into it because I just love spending time with them.
And so let's talk about that because you weren't born doing filmmaking right away, right? This kind of passion of yours. It's interesting actually when I'll let you share your story obviously, and there's some parallels to what got me interested in wrongful convictions as well. But I've heard you explain this before. I think it's neat for our listeners to see you become an accomplished journalist, filmmaker. You're highlighting people's stories and really advocating for those that may not have a voice without the voice that you're giving them. But that came to you kind of in a I guess weird moment that you decided this is something I want to do. So can you explain to our listeners how this became a passion of yours?
Yeah, for sure. I think it was back in 2015, 2016 when the Serial podcast came out. And, that was the podcast that put podcasts on the map.
Right.
And I listened to that, and it was a non-science story. And I just couldn't believe it. I was like, this guy was 17 and ripped out of his parents' bedroom at, I don't know, it was like 4 a.m. or something. Like, how terrifying. And he had a little brother who watched this happen. And the whole world was entertained, and as was I. But I walked away thinking, this guy is still sitting in prison, and we're all like, oh, what a fun, great story, and really his family is tortured for decades. And so it really bothered me. And so I decided that I wanted to help in any way I can. So I started organizing a fundraiser for his legal defense. And in New York, it was the very first in-person fundraiser that anyone had done for Adnan. I mean, now they've raised so much money. His story went viral, but this was way in the beginning. And I worked in fashion at the time. And so all I knew was clothes. And I was like, I'm going to make free Adnan shirts. I'm going to sell them at the fundraiser. And we got local bands together. We sold tickets to this event, and, it was at a bar, and the ticket sales and the shirt sales, we just donated. And at the time, it was the largest donation made to the family. And so we ended up being in contact, and till this day, they're like family to me. They're just the most wonderful human beings. And so I became close with them. And then those shirts went viral all over the world, which was also a crazy experience because I was packaging them in my apartment, and I was like, what is happening right now? But that's a side story. And so it ended up that Adnan had a post-conviction hearing in 2016, and I went to it in Baltimore. And so I was sitting there with his family. I believe it was 5 days long. And I was sitting behind his mom. She's in the front row, and I'm sitting behind her, and I'm watching her every day. And she has these prayer beads, and she's just praying and praying. And they were the sweetest. Like, they didn't even let me stay in a hotel. They were like, where are you staying? And I was like, just down the street from the courthouse. And they were like, it is not safe. They were like, pack up your things. They picked me up. They took me, got my things, and took me home with them. They were like, you're staying with us. It was just so kind. And so every day I would drive with them and drive back with them. So on one of the days, like towards the end of the 5 days, we're driving, and Shamim, Adnan's mom, says, I don't understand what's happening. And I'm in the back seat, and his brother Yusuf, Adnan's brother, is driving. And I'm like, what do you mean you don't understand what's happening? Like, we're almost at the end of this thing, And she was like, I don't understand what's happening in the courtroom. And so then I explained it to her. I speak Urdu, so I explained it to her in our language and told her they're doing the same thing to your son that they did when he was 17. They're derailing this whole thing. They're not allowing his alibi witness to really present what she knows. And they're just railroading him. And she was like, oh. And like, that was the moment where I was like, this poor woman, like, she's an immigrant. Her English isn't great, let alone legal jargon. She's just not understanding. All she knows to do is pray. Like, she's religious. And so she's just praying for a good outcome, and that's it. And I was just heartbroken. I was like, this is such bullshit, And that was the moment where I was like, I got to do more. Like, this is just ridiculous, And then the next day or so, we were at dinner with the family, and there was a camera crew around. And so Arabia said, hey, listen, you guys might have to sign like a waiver because you might be on camera. You can't tell anyone because it's an HBO doc that's coming out. It's not out yet. I was so naive, Dave. I knew nothing. Like, I did not know a single thing about filmmaking, like not a single thing. I didn't have a single contact in the industry. I didn't do nothing. And I saw 3 people. I saw like a cameraman, an audio person, and maybe a producer or someone. I don't even know who they were. And in my stupid mind at the time, I was like, these 3 people are making an HBO doc? I was like, I got this. I was like, I could do this. And so I promptly came home and enrolled into New York Film Academy and was like, I'm just going to make movies because that'll help get more attention on these cases.
That's so cool. And now you have an IMDb profile officially.
That's
Now,
true.
now you're legitimate. That's really neat. I mean, I'm gonna go back to you helping explain to Adnan's mom kind of what was going on, and I'm sure you've seen this in the work that you've done, and they're trying to impact the criminal justice system. But it's amazing how much people are unaware of the process, whatever that process,
Yes.
even if they're involved in it intimately, right? I mean, it's kind of crazy. And so I'm curious when you're making a film, and I know you do a lot of writing. I think are you still writing for Forbes as well?
I'm not anymore, but I did for almost 10 years.
So you're crafting
Yes.
this message, right? Whether it's in print or it's on video or you're doing the podcast, but being aware of our listeners really aware, they have the same level of knowledge that you do, maybe of the criminal justice system, or maybe that even you didn't and you had to do some research. And how do you kind of measure that of what do you take for granted that you assume listeners know this process? Everybody knows this, but then maybe realize no, people don't know what an appeal process looks like, or people don't know what a wrongful conviction process looks like. Is there a big gap there, you think?
I think there's a huge gap, a huge gap. And I don't know that much. I'm constantly learning through the cases that I'm covering. I mean, I learned what an Alford plea was only when I was, dealing with Adnan's case back then. And so I'm learning constantly. But that was one of the main reasons I got into this because I felt like the general public is so unaware that wrongful convictions actually occur. I think most people assume that if they've arrested you, if you're on the news, that you must have done something because how did they get to you? And that's just not true. That's just not true. There's just so many statistics and so much information on, even if your photo ends up in, you have any kind of record, your photo ends up in the police station for any reason whatsoever. You can end up in a lineup for a murder. And, maybe what you did was shoplifting one time when you were young or something. You never know. There's such a gap.
Do you have, because I want to go to the shows you've worked on, and I know you had a full length that did really well. I don't want to talk about that and your experience in that capacity, but I asked this before we started recording, but I'm curious I don't let you answer it, but when you start watching documentaries now, like are you watching Dateline and 60 Minutes and every Netflix special that comes out? And if you're watching that, are you doing it with a different eye than maybe you did 10 years ago, not realizing that the lighting and the audio and the editing that goes into it?
For sure. 100%. Yeah. It's really funny because when I first came home from Adnan's post-conviction hearing and I was like, I want to go into film. I called a couple people that I knew that had done like stuff for ABC and so it was my neighbor actually. I didn't know her that well, but I knew she'd done it. And two people I talked to said the same line to me. They said, just watch documentaries, but really watch them. And I was like, what the fuck are they talking about? Like, what do you mean really watch them? Like I wasn't watching them before. It made no sense to me. And that's all they said. And I was like, this is not helpful. Like, I just don't even know what you mean. Now I understand, of course, it should have been explained better, but what they mean is like really pay attention to the transitions between the scenes and the music and when it comes in and when it goes out and all those things. And I definitely pay attention to that now, which kind of takes away from the experience because your mind is kind of divided on the story. And then you're
Right.
also like, wait, what's this weird music all of a sudden?
Right.
Which I
So,
normally would have never thought about.
well, that's what I'm curious about. I mean, there's so much to explore, but and from you going through like the training and the education on how to do this and how to be a filmmaker, are there things you learned that you thought you would have never thought of before, or you're like, I didn't realize this much work went into this part of filmmaking? Is there anything
Oh,
that stood out?
everything. But the
Yeah.
editing process, I can't even tell you. Like, it's a good thing I like what I do because in the editing process, I've probably seen my film like 100 times. Who wants to watch the same thing a
Right.
hundred times, right? But when you're editing it, it's like the same scene 20 times to get, edit out whatever you need to edit out and add the right music. And so you're just rewatching the same little clip endlessly, and it's really
Right.
tedious.
Well, so I had the experience of being asked to be a guest on a documentary. It was about a wrongful conviction and or an alleged wrongful conviction. It's still pending, but they wanted my opinion on the interview interrogation process. And so I get called by somebody like you, right, in your position that says, "Hey, I want an expert on interrogation practices. Can you come down and review this case and talk about it?" So okay. So I was flown down and stayed at like an Airbnb that they made it look like it was my my residence and I'm watching this interrogation and giving critical feedback, and she's asking me questions. It was about 7 or 8 hours of conversation.
Right.
And I'm terrified of what is this going to look like when it comes out, of course.
Of
And,
course.
as you know, this it's not like it came out a week later. This was like, I don't know, 12 months later.
For sure.
And I think I was in it for about 3 minutes. And I'm thinking, man, did I suck that bad? Or do they need that
No.
much footage of each person? The amount of editing and work that goes into it is just crazy. But I think, I mean, let you kind of explain that. But that's probably interesting for listeners is how much film, how much interviewing, how much B-roll goes into making maybe a 60-minute episode of something.
Yeah, it's insane. You have hundreds of hours of all of that, of interviews, of B-roll, and sometimes it's still not enough. It's really crazy.
Yeah, I'm sure. We get questions a lot from people that, they'll be in a training class with us, and if, our clients are usually investigators, whether in the law enforcement space, private sector, and they watch films like yours. They watch true crime, and a lot of times there's this like skepticism of, well, am I getting the whole story? And
Hmm.
so from a filmmaker, I'm assuming there's got to be times where you're torn between, hey, I've got to make sure this fits in a certain segment or a certain amount of time. I want to make sure all the facts are in there, but I also want to make sure all the emotion is in there. I mean, that's got to be some tough. How do you make those decisions? I guess is my question of what to cut and what not to cut and what to prioritize when you're telling a story.
So, I feel like my lack of knowledge about this industry really helped me for two reasons. One, because I just go by my gut feeling. I just go by, reading people and what I find fascinating, and I just go with that. I don't do anything else, to be honest, which has been working for me. So I'm just going to stick to that. And so I actually don't know maybe what I should be doing. I don't know. But I always say that how naive I was about this industry luckily worked out in my favor. Less than 1% of films ever get into a festival, and even less than that ever make it on a streaming platform. If I had known that going in, I would have never made a film. I would have been like, I'm set up to fail. So everything I didn't know, I'm actually thankful for, because I can just, wing it and try and do things whatever way I think it makes sense to me, and see if it works.
Yeah, that's a good point because and you're also making a film that you'd want to watch, right? That
Yes.
helps. What would you want to be informed about? And what helps you understand the story?
For sure. And I'll say this about true crime. One of the things that really like guided me to answer your previous question, I noticed and still do that on TV, majority of true crime is very sensationalized, which I hate. Like, these stories are real people and they're real stories, and they're already horrific enough as it is. We don't need to sensationalize anything. We don't need to make it, dramatize it. I don't feel. And so when I'm editing and all of that stuff, I just try and keep like the raw emotion and the raw information and the real information and nothing more. I never like included crime scene photos and stuff for that same reason. I didn't feel like that was a nice thing to do to the family of the deceased. I didn't think it was necessary, and I didn't think it was a point. But what you see on TV is often that, unfortunately, because that's what sells.
Yeah, I have you found yourself, when I'll give you an example before I ask this question. So when I'm either hosting a podcast and I've had the opportunity to have people like Amanda Knox on who've experienced, wrongful conviction and try to tell their story. And then, I've written articles about some different cases that making a murderer case, and Brendan Dassey is really what got me inspired to be passionate about wrongful convictions. But then I start to see advertisements for watch this podcast, watch this documentary. There's a new one on the Gabby Petito
Yes.
case, and there's got to be this balance between like there's entertainment value that people want people to watch something, so you want to market it. But at the end of the day, it's a real person, it's a real story. And so you ever have that kind of, I don't know if it's an ethical dilemma or just kind of this emotional checkpoint of, wait a second, I want to market this because I want people's story to be told, but it's not a movie, it's a real story. Do you ever have an issue there that conflict you have to deal with?
Yeah, for sure. I got into this whole thing, as you know, to become an advocate for these people who I felt like had been unjustly silenced. And so I wanted to amplify their voices. And so I thought I was doing this great thing, in my mind. I was like, and what's so funny is when I was at Adnan's post-conviction hearing, the two shows that were huge were Making a Murder and The Jinx. And that is what made me think, look at how many eyeballs they got on those cases. That's why I'm going to do this. So that's what
Right.
inspired me too initially. But anyways, of course, now I lost my train of thought. What did you just ask
I'm
me?
talking about the like telling somebody's story versus
Yes,
the
yes, yes.
publication of it.
So there was, I thought everything I was doing was great. And then there was one moment when I was filming 16 Years, which is the feature film about Jeffrey Deskovic. And we were in a studio and it was just three of us. It was Jeff that I was interviewing, and I was obviously the interviewer and had the audio, and then I had a cameraman. So it was just the three of us. And I had finally gotten, after doing FOIA requests for years, I had finally gotten all the audio tapes of Jeff's interrogation. And so I played it for him to ask him questions about them. And, I told him that I have this and want you to listen to it. And he said yes. And then I handed him the phone and he listened to it. And it's all on tape and it's in the film actually. So when anyone who watches it will see it. And it's a really tough scene to watch. And it was an even tougher situation to be in. But he listened to it and something happened. Something, he got triggered in some way and some PTSD or something. And he had really a mental breakdown in front of my eyes. And to the point where it was very concerning and I was not equipped to deal with this. And I couldn't have foreseen this happening either, of course. And he broke down so much to the point that he started asking me if this was real and if I was a real person and if he has ever even met me or if he's still in a cell and is just making it all up and it's all his imagination because he can't deal with being locked up in a cell. And I mean, he was just not in reality. And I didn't know what to do with that, and I looked over at the cameraman because I was like, I need help, and he was crying and I was holding it in and trying really hard not to cry. And so I was like, I just didn't even know. Jeff was crying. I had Kleenex in my purse. I got the Kleenex. I dropped the audio. The audio cuts out because I was so panicked, I grabbed Kleenex. I went and gave him a hug and I told him it's okay. And, I shut the cameras off and gave him water. And then there was a balcony in this studio. Thank God. I said, let's get some fresh air. He went out there for a few minutes and then I went out there and I was feeling so guilty and I was feeling like such a failure because I was like, my whole goal was to shed light on wrongful convictions, to be an advocate for these people and to amplify their voices, is not to re-traumatize them. And so I felt like, what am I doing? Like, all of this is just terrible. And so I went outside, and I'll never forget this because it was amazing. And I said to Jeff, I apologized profusely. And I said, none of this will ever be in the film. You never have to worry about that. Like, we'll delete it, like, completely, and I'm so sorry, and there's anything I can do. And he said he'd gotten himself together by then and realized that this is not imaginary. And he said, no. He said, you absolutely have to put this in the film. He said, if you don't, then what is it all for? He's like, people should be able to face what they did to me. And if they can't, he's like, then what are we doing this for? And he was so right and so brave, and that is why it's in the film. And it's really, really tough to watch. And it was a moment where I really questioned if I should just quit.
Yeah, that's powerful. That's powerful. It goes back to what you said before is people who've experienced that. It's amazing the strength and courage they have to tell the story.
For sure.
You were almost at a weaker point than he was then, right? He had to carry you through that decision.
Yeah, yeah. Truly, I mean, he made me feel better about it, and I felt bad about that too.
Right. Well, it's so interesting. And I know we have a lot of people that listen that also watch true crime of some capacity and probably don't realize, and maybe even experience this doing the interviews or at least talking, letting people tell their story. It's not just call somebody up, schedule an appointment, they sit down and they just freely tell their narrative for an hour, right? You may have to become a counselor, an investigator, a
Mhm.
therapist. You have to figure out how do you get somebody to tell their story, feel comfortable, trusting that you're going to tell it in their true narrative. So have you learned any lessons along the way about how to be maybe either a better interviewer or create an environment that allows somebody to tell their story more openly?
The one thing that I always do before I start, and I truly mean it, they sign that personal release form, and I think that makes people feel uncomfortable because it's like, you can use my likeness and my everything for whatever you want. And so I always tell them that like I'm on your side and this is your voice. And so anything I ask you that you don't want to answer, you can tell me to shut up. Like I tell them right off the bat. I'm like, you can tell me that I'm totally out of line. Like you're in control of this, not me. I always say that to them. And I also tell them if you happen to say something and you regret it afterwards or, you know, you mess up or whatever, just tell me and we just won't include it. And I tell them that and I mean it. Even though what they sign on paper says like we're allowed to use all the footage or whatever, because that's just not my goal. Is to do something other than what the subject would want or like, as long as we're reporting the truth.
Well, I think
Yeah.
that's important. I mean, we focus a lot. There's a lot of parallels here between an investigative interview and a journalistic interview. Is giving somebody autonomy, so they feel like they're in control of the conversation. If they need
Yes.
a timeout or a break, they get one, and people are more likely to cooperate versus just be compliant when they feel like it's their choice of what to say and how to say it, I think.
For sure. And if they know you care, about
Right.
them, it goes a
Yeah,
long
and
way.
if you're genuine, yeah, that's a good point. And I mentioned this to you a little bit earlier, but I think this is a really good takeaway for listeners as well. Whether somebody listens as an investigator or just talks to people and wants to let people tell their story, but silence can be so awkward in a conversation, but silence can also be really powerful to give somebody a platform. So how do you feel like you use that when you're letting someone tell their story? Is just the power of nothing, the power of silence.
You know what's so interesting, and I'm sure you know this because like this is your wheelhouse. When you stay silent, it actually drives people to say more because they'll like reflect on whatever the last thing they said is, and then you're not saying anything. And so then they're gonna elaborate or tell you more details or, talk about something else. And it's fascinating how that works, but it really works.
Right. Yeah. People, silence is uncomfortable and people want to fill it.
Yes.
And, even we had a guest on in our first season, Anna Papalia, and she does advice for job interviews, job interviewers and job interviewees. And in the same context is when you ask somebody a question about, tell me about a time you had a conflict at work and how you handled it. And you allow the candidate to answer, and then you allow some silence after they answer. The candidate wants to continue to tell more details of their
Yep.
story, and then you have more information. But silence feels so uncomfortable for people that we're always so quick to end it with another question, and you may have
Yeah.
lost some really gold that you could have.
For sure, for sure. I learned so many great things at New York Film Academy, and like the one thing they said is, when the interview's done and you actually say, okay, that's a wrap, cut or whatever, never turn the mic off immediately. Like you got to wait 5, 10 minutes, do the other stuff first, wrap up the camera and stuff, because that's where it's gold. Someone will always say something like, you know what you didn't ask me, or you know what I forgot to say, because now they feel comfortable, and it works every time.
That's a good point, and it terrifies me on the other side of a microphone sometimes because I've had the opportunity to be interviewed by whether it's a journalist writing an article or it's been on a podcast or video. And you're right. It's at the end of the conversation. You feel like this scripted interview is over. And
Yes.
now it's just like, okay, that's
You're
pretty much
comfortable.
done. And then all of a sudden it's like, okay, now I can say whatever I want. And so I've gotten much better at looking at that little camera box, that camera pack, battery pack on my waist and making sure it's flipped to off before I reveal all my secrets. Because that you're right.
Well, that was the jinx, right? Robert Durst,
Yes, right.
right?
That's when all
Like,
the juice comes out. Yeah,
yeah, the audio was on when he went to the bathroom that he admitted to murder. Like, it's
right.
insane.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
Well, so that same point, if you're doing an interview portion of a film, and so you're sitting down talking to somebody, maybe it's been a person who's been impacted, maybe you get a chance to talk to an investigator or a family member or whatever. How much of that conversation do you think you're scripting, meaning you have a list of here's the 10 questions I want to ask versus somebody's telling their story and you're kind of letting it organically flow? How do you balance those two things?
So I do kind of what you just said. I have my list of like not a lot, maybe 10 to 15 questions. You know, I look at their story and I just get like the main points and I write them down just because my memory sucks. But then when I start with the first question, I'll just let them tell their story. And then I only ask questions pertaining to what they're saying, unless we run out of things to talk about. And then I'll go back to my list and be like, hey, was there anything that we missed that I had jotted down in the beginning, and then I'll ask another question. But otherwise, I just let it flow the way they tell it, and I ask the questions pertaining to whatever part of the story that they're sharing.
Yeah, I think that's so important. So many people, whether it's any kind of, I've been again through like a media interview or an investigative interview where you can tell, here's the 10 questions I need to ask somebody. And it's almost if when you go from question one to two, if my answer doesn't connect those two dots, I can tell that you're not listening to me, right? I answered something. There's a follow-up question you should be asking me. And
Yeah, for
instead, it's
sure.
like checklist and just go down the list.
For sure, for sure. By the way, what was this doc that you were interviewed on? And that means you have an IMDb also.
Oh man. What the one I was referring to was on the confession tapes. There was an episode
Oh, no
in
way.
season, yeah, and it was about a homicide case of this abduction of this 16-year-old girl, and then her body was found a few miles away from where her car had broken down, like overnight, early morning. Um, and the police, in their investigation, they identified a suspect based off of a truck. They thought it was his vehicle. They saw on a really grainy, terrible kind of surveillance camera from a near gas station that happened to drive by where this broken down car was. And so anyway, my portion was to look at the interview, the interrogation of the suspect who eventually confessed. But it was one of these confessions, and I know you've seen this in your work, that in order to get to the confession, there was lies about evidence, there was promises of leniency, there were threats of if you don't cooperate, here's the terrible things that are going to happen to you. And then there was what we call contamination, where the interviewer gives a whole bunch of details of the crime
Hmm.
during the interview, and so once a person admits, all they're doing is kind of regurgitating it. And so, so I had the opportunity, which was really cool, terrifying and cool, but to kind of talk through what's happening in this interview that maybe a layperson didn't recognize
Hmm.
when you're
Hmm.
looking at the confession. But yeah, that was the one that was quite a few hours of Q&A and then about 3 minutes of screen time.
Oh,
So
yeah. I'm gonna
yes,
watch it. That's
yeah,
awesome.
how great. Yeah, that was not the point. I did not ask Gia to drop that, by the way, in in the conversation.
I have to watch it. What do you mean?
Yeah. Well, so that kind of triggers me for another question. So in that role for me, I mean, our company, our training company, we're all very used to being on a stage or behind a microphone. So we're somewhat comfortable in those appearances. But I have to imagine a lot of people that you're interviewing, excuse me, a lot of people that you're interviewing, or a lot of people in a documentary have never sat in front of a camera before, have
Mhm.
never had a microphone put in their face, never had their story told by somebody else. And so, what kind of, I guess, coaching, advice, or tips are you giving to somebody in preparation to be interviewed on these shows? Because as I'm saying that, I'm just thinking about all the different times I've seen people interviewed on the news or in a documentary, thinking, "Man, did this person even know they were going to be interviewed today?" Because it's like they had no idea what they were about to say or how to say it.
It's so interesting. And again, I'm gonna, go back to what we were saying about people who've been wrongfully incarcerated. What I've noticed, which is so awesome, every single person I've ever interviewed that's been wrongfully incarcerated needs zero coaching. Zero. None whatsoever. They want to look their best at all times because that was stolen from them. They honestly just don't give a fuck because they're like, this is my story and I've been holding it in for so long. I want to share it, right? They're just an open book and they're just ready to go, they're just ready to do it. And then all the other people, the journalists, who everyone else that you talk to about the story, the lawyers, they are more like, do I look okay on camera? What should I wear? Is this okay? Is that
Right.
okay? Well, are you going to edit it? What if I say something? And it's so interesting. It's another one of those things where these people who have been through this horrific experience just get it. And then the rest of us focus on these little things that are way less important, I find.
Yeah. I had a podcast once that I did as a guest, and this goes back to what you just said. I it was a kind of an organic conversation, at least I thought it was. And I made a joke that, of course, I thought was hilarious. And there was two hosts. And so one of the hosts laughed right away. And the other one was like a delayed laugh. Like he didn't get the joke. It was probably like a
Yeah.
smart joke. So it took a minute. And anyway, there was a producer listening or an editor or whatever was like listening to the podcast. And so he stopped us and he said, that was Dave, that was funny what you said, but the laugh wasn't really on time. Can we go back and you guys do that again? And I was like, you can't be witty like 3 minutes later. That
Yeah.
doesn't
On
work.
repeat. Yeah.
Yeah. But so I asked that to go back to what you just said, or give that example. Have you ever had a time or other times when people like tell their story or give an answer and you're almost like, can you do it again? Because you want to hear it in a different tone, emotion. Maybe there's a part of it they didn't expand on. Is there a way to do that without saying, hey, you could have done that better? Can you tell your story again?
I don't do that a lot. I really don't. Like, I'm trying to think back of any time that I did, and the times I can think of, it's because we didn't get the audio right, the volume level wasn't right. Like, it's on us, not on them. The reason I don't really do that is because the thing I love about documentaries and the thing I love about interviewing people and talking to people is the authenticity of it. So I kind of like when it's just is what it is. If the joke didn't land, it didn't land. If
Right.
that was awkward, it was awkward. Let's see it awkward on camera. I
Right.
really like that. Like that's what I really thrive in that space. I think it's interesting to me.
Yeah.
And documentaries don't need to be polished. We're not making like Batman. So
Yeah.
it's like I like it that way. So I don't really do that much. The
Yeah.
only time I can remember is if we messed up on our end.
What kind have you had any mess ups that you're like, damn, the camera wasn't rolling or the audio wasn't on or the battery died and something that was crucial?
Oh, for sure. All of that has happened.
Yeah.
All of that has happened way more often in the beginning than, now because I have a checklist now in my phone and I'm like, I go through it every single time because I'm like
Yeah.
just a type A perfectionist person. So, but in the beginning, yeah, for sure. We've left the audio off. We've left the camera off, like all
Right.
kinds of
You
things.
have to
Yeah.
do this again. Have you
Yeah.
had, because obviously when we're looking, especially at wrongful convictions, there's a lot of emotion involved. And we've spoken about the person who's been wrongly convicted, maybe family members, maybe journalists who already covered the case at the time that it happened, and they can give you some insight. But then there's another side to it that may or may not be resistant to talk about it. Maybe original investigators or jurors or people who may be family members of the victim. So
Hmm.
have you been met with resistance, or how do you kind of maneuver that side of the story when you want people to tell their story, but you also don't want to put them in a position where you're accusing them of doing something wrong?
So I can't really answer that question because I haven't been through it yet. I've only made two films. In both cases, in one, Janine Pirro was the DA at the time. I wrote her and wrote her. She never wrote me back, so we just had to include in the doc that we made multiple attempts to reach out, and she never got back to us. And I made the decision myself to not reach out to the detective or the victim's family. The victim's family, because they made it known to Jeff beforehand that they do not want to speak about it. It's too hurtful for them. And so I didn't want to do that. So I
Yeah.
didn't do it. And the detective still parades around, which I have someone else in the film talk about this. He still parades around saying that he still thinks Jeff is guilty, which he was cleared on DNA evidence, and they found the real killer confessed. Like it can't be a cleaner, it was a wrongful conviction. And so I wasn't gonna perpetuate that. I wasn't gonna put
Yeah.
him on camera saying that. So I didn't even reach out to him because I was like, "You're
No, I
useless."
think that's fair. It's crazy because and this is just human nature and biases that we all have, but I've seen that so many times where people who have been part of a conviction or part of a decision or part of whatever it is, and somebody else wants to second guess it, even if that second guessing comes through like DNA, proven factual evidence, it's so hard for people to acknowledge the fact that, hey, maybe I got this wrong 10 years
Oh,
ago, 20
that
years
has
ago.
been the thing that like boggles my mind. It's like human nature is so ingrained in wanting to be right to the point where I often think about this, to the point where you could ruin someone's life, take their whole life away or 25 years of their life, which is insane. And after the fact, when you're proven wrong, still try and assert that you were right for the sole reason of not wanting to admit that you were wrong. And then I think about it a step forward and I'm like, do you realize that if you just came out and made a public statement that feel guilty and you were so wrong and you got it wrong and you're sorry, that people would actually probably forgive you and like you, but now we just hate you because you're married to being right, even in the face of all this evidence. It's
Right.
bizarre to me. It's so
Yeah.
bizarre. Yeah.
Yeah. Certainty is a problem, right? I mean,
Yes.
investigators should have doubt, jurors should have doubt. And that's when we say doubt, I guess it's not to be skeptical of everything and everything is fake news, but at least investigate what it is that you're trying to determine when you're impacting somebody's life. I wonder on the flip side of that, and I know your case, the case you're talking about with Jeff, you've been intimately involved and I mean, you've known Jeff now for what, probably over a decade, I would say.
9 years. Yeah.
Yeah.
Almost 10. Yep.
So you know it very well, but I always wonder, like, there's true crime podcasts out there, for example, where it's like another episode every week, and so they're rolling through all these different cases. Do you think that there's ever the same error could be made on the other side, where you have somebody who so believes in a story or believes in maybe somebody's potential innocence that they're going to ignore the alternative facts as well? Do you think that can happen on both sides of the coin?
For sure. Yeah. I'm sure it can. Yeah, absolutely. There's so many cases for whatever reason, that guilty people walk free as
Right.
well, you
Yeah.
know? Yeah, I covered one on my podcast and it was the saddest thing ever because I talked to the mom and the family and their son was murdered and the killer walked free in the end. And yeah, and it's like,
Yeah. Well, that's what's so fascinating to me about true crime is, it could be a Dateline. You got 60 minutes of a Dateline episode, and now people walk away experts in the investigation. And on the flip side, you hear from, maybe a detective or a journalist who covered the story for 2.5 years. And so it's like, how are we forming an opinion in such a short time? And so I guess my question there is, what's your goal and your purpose when you're, I know Conviction is the latest one and it won some awards too. So you haven't said any of that yet, but you've been doing very well for yourself. You said 1% of these films make it.
yeah, less
Um,
than. It's
yeah,
crazy.
less than. And so not only have you made it, but you've been recognized for it, which is really cool. But what's your main purpose for what do you want people to walk away with when you produce a film?
I think, my purpose when I started was truly just to raise awareness that wrongful convictions do occur. So people aren't so sure that when they see Jeff on the news, they're like, oh, he did it, right? Like trial by media is such a huge thing. That was my goal then. Luckily, and it's been really nice, I feel like that's been happening a little bit. I've even personally heard from people who've been like, I was moved by this, so I'm doing this now, which is really a really awesome feeling. Now, my goal is to tell the story in my next film of somebody who's currently incarcerated so that not only can we shed light on their case and amplify their voice, but maybe we can uncover something that could help them get free one day, even if in the smallest way. That's what I'm hoping to do with the next film.
Yeah, that's powerful. I mean, we referenced Making a Murderer earlier, and your experience listening to Serial and Adnan's case is similar to when I watched Making a Murderer, like majority of the country did, in about a 2-day binge of 10 hours of Netflix in 2015,
That's
I
what
think
I
it
did.
was.
Yeah.
Yeah, I watched that and I was like, wait a second, if from our training firm, we teach interviews and interrogations, and what just happened, if we don't say something about this, we're basically condoning it, and we
Yes.
need to stand up and say something. But if the documentary was never made, if the interrogation was never video recorded, I
Yeah.
probably wouldn't have known about it. And
Oh,
so
for sure.
there's so
Same.
much power in media.
Yeah, there is. There really is.
I could talk to you for hours about this stuff, but the last thing I just want to wrap up with, I think the logistics of making a film are just so fascinating. So we've covered a little bit, but how much it goes into finding the story, interviewing people, all the B-roll, all the footage, all the editing, all the craziness. So we get to the end and you're finally breathing and you think, okay, I've got this great package of a film. Well, how does it go from there to now all of a sudden you're streaming on Amazon Prime, or all of a sudden you get a Netflix contract? Like, how does that process work?
So I don't really even know the answer to that question, but I will tell you for me, I didn't know. So I just kept going. And you know what happened? The film got into a whole bunch of film festivals. My short did, Conviction did, which was awesome. I was over the moon. I was like, it was my first film. Not only was it my first film, it was my student project at New York Film Academy. It was my final exam. So it wasn't even something I thought would see the light of day. And then on the final day, the editing professor was watching all the films to give you your final feedback because it was your final exam score. And he watched it and I was like, okay, so what do I need to do? And he was like, nothing. This is amazing. And I was like, what? And he goes, you should submit this to film festivals. And I said, what are film festivals? I did not know what they were. And he was like, what? He's like, there's an evening class on film festivals. You need to take that class and then you need to, I was like, okay. So I enrolled in that evening class and I ended up submitting it. Anyways, it got into a bunch of them. I was so excited. And literally 2 weeks before the premiere at the Anthology Film Archives in New York City, which I was like, my first film was going to play there. You know, I was so excited. Yeah. COVID hit, all the theaters got shut down and every single screening from that point forward got canceled. And I was feeling so bad for myself. I was like, it's such a impossible thing to obtain and I obtained it and now it's just dead. You know, I was just feeling like crap. And so it was COVID and I was feeling super down. And so I started joining all these filmmakers like Rami from that show and like all these people who were also just stuck at home with nothing to do, started doing Zoom calls just to like stay creative and do stuff. I joined like 50 of these Zoom calls. Like every third day I was on a Zoom call with whoever was doing them. And I met so many people in the film industry that way because everybody was bored and that's how I learned how to submit it to Amazon. And that's how I ended up doing that. As a result of that, we got a bunch of screenings and stuff. And that's how I met somebody who watched the film, a lawyer who loved it so much. He connected me to Buchwald. And then they watched the film, they signed me. And now Buchwald is the one that's working on selling 16 Years, which is my feature film, to any of the streaming platforms. So for me, that's how it went. That's not the normal trajectory. Like you definitely need a sales agent. You know, I didn't know how to find one. I didn't know who the sales agents were. So I was just trying to navigate this thing by talking to people.
Yeah, I think that's awesome. Well, I want people to just appreciate more next time they're scrolling through Netflix and Amazon Prime or Hulu or whatever else from all the 400 true crime documentaries, how much work goes into each one and how low the likelihood that they actually got to that point. So it's pretty incredible and pretty neat what you did. How can people find more about you and about the films and your podcast and stuff that you're working on?
All my stuff is on my website. So it's just Jia Rizvi. It's JIARIZVI.com. And for anyone who does want to attend any screenings, we have a few of them coming up in New York and in Canada. So I have a mailing list on my site. If they want to sign up, we send those and, you know, anybody can come if they just request a ticket because they're private screenings at the moment.
Well, when you're done listening, because we're almost done, so don't hang up on us yet. When you're done listening, check out the show notes and we'll make sure we put we'll put your website on our show notes, make it easier for people to click and join the list and find out more information about you. And then when you have nothing to do on Friday night, go on Amazon Prime and you can watch your film, which is pretty cool. And give it a 5-star rating, I would say.
Please.
Well. Last question I have for you. So if we've got people who are watching, either watching a documentary or maybe it's just they want to know more about wrongful convictions. But if there's kind of one last message you want to leave our listeners with that you hope you were able to educate them on or you want them to think differently about, what would that be?
You know, the thing that gets me the most that I think I didn't even know at the time when I started is somewhere around, we'll never know the real number, but somewhere around 3 to 5% of people are wrongfully incarcerated. If you do the math on how many people are incarcerated in the US, that's like 100,000 people, I believe. And if you think about how it impacts that one person, but then also their family, their siblings, their mom and dad, and their friends, the amount of people in this country that are actually impacted by this is huge. It's a real problem that I just wish had more attention.
Yeah, I think that's a good takeaway. And if people want, I know the National Registry of Exonerations has a good database and a website that explains a lot of those cases and categorizes them by causes or contributing factors. And, you know, particularly interesting to our listeners are the amount of, you know, false confessions is one of the leading causes of wrongful convictions. And so how much we can own that process. So I think that's a really important takeaway. And I hope people also learned, because I learned in talking with you, just storytelling and messaging and communicating and how important it is that you're doing it, but also letting somebody else tell their story the power of silence and empathy. So it was really, really good stuff.
For sure. Thanks for having me, Dave. This was awesome.
Thank you for joining me, and good luck on whatever comes out next. Your IMDb profile will continue to grow. We appreciate it.
As will yours.
Yes.
If you're going to keep bringing mine up, I'm going to keep bringing yours up.
Well, thank you all for listening. Thanks, Jia, for joining on that Truth Be Told podcast.
To help more listeners find our show, please provide us a rating, give us a follow, and share this episode with your colleagues. For the latest news and to engage with our guests, follow Truth Be Told on your favorite social media apps. And don't forget, we are available on all major platforms, including Apple, Spotify, and watch a video of this episode on YouTube. On behalf of our guests and valued sponsors, thanks again for listening to this episode of Truth Be Told.